This is Evan Bland of the Omaha World-Herald. Good morning. Happy New Year.
Hey, guys. Yeah, I don't know if we've exceeded the statute of limitations there, but Happy New Year.
Yeah, mine is the 7th. Larry David said it was over this weekend.
See, I mean, we just haven't had a chance to interact.
Yes.
So, I think you got to take that into account, too.
Yeah.
I think if I said Happy New Year to you in a week, like January 14th, there would be like a weird look like, oh, I guess it is January. I guess it is 2025. So I think this is, I'll give myself to the 8th of January. 8th of January.
Okay. Well, we're on the outer limit here, so let's enjoy this.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, you know what, Evan? Happy New Year. Happy New Year.
This is great.
Now that we're all happy,
yeah.
Let's talk about negative stuff. No, just kidding. So we have a couple of days off before the semifinals, and it could end up being an all Big Ten final. So Northern football is back. You could have Michigan one year, and the next year another Big Ten team win the national title, and Ohio State is in perfect position. But we have seen Indiana, SMU get into the tournament. We have seen a lot of all over the map takeaways. Is there a takeaway if you're a school like Nebraska that just went 7-6, but you have resources to compete, you have passion of a fan base to drive you, you play in a conference that gives you an edge to make your resume look better? Is there a takeaway from you watching the games and who's been playing in the playoff that could apply to Nebraska next year?
Well, I think the takeaway is you can flip things a lot quicker than any fans are used to having it done in the past. I mean, it used to always be, hey, you know within, say, 2 or 3 years if you had a head coach who would make you a contender. And then the conversation, if that wasn't the case, became, well, maybe you could sort of get there over the course of 3 or 4 recruiting classes, and maybe if you adjust things and things break just right, you could crack that upper echelon. And I think what Indiana showed was you can do that quicker. And certainly their circumstance was unique with a head coach who had a pretty good team. James Madison, who brought a lot of those guys over, and so you can't really follow that blueprint specifically. But I think we're continuing to see more parity in college football, and not necessarily more parity over 120 or 130 FBS teams, but more parity certainly within the power conferences, right? With the SEC, with the Big Ten, and maybe a couple other teams. But really, that's where a lot of that is concentrated. That's going to be even more emphasized with revenue sharing coming about this summer. So Nebraska is going to be one of those teams, and they're not going to be a ton of them, but they're going to be one of those teams with $20.5 million to spread out with players before you even dip into the NIL honeypot. And so I think we're already starting to see it right now with the success they're having in the portal. Like they're landing players and contending for players that they haven't really been in the mix for to this degree in the portal era. And I think a lot of that does have to do with resources and the recognition and acknowledgement that the Big Ten is one of the big two right now when it comes to access to the playoff and things of that nature. So yeah, I think there's hope there that you can turn things around quickly, that if you identify talent that you're bringing in from the portal, if you're smart with your roster management and the resources that you do have, you have the schedule, you have the support, you have all the other stuff that's always been there for a quicker turnaround. So yeah, I mean, I think 6, 7, and 6 can become something greater than that pretty quickly if you develop the guys that you have and you're able to, make the changes that you want to make in terms of personnel and coaching staff as well.
Gary and I have talked about a lot how Nebraska is a developmental program, and that how Matt Rule runs this talent, runs who he brings in his program is, okay, what's your talent? What's your measurables? Like how good of an athlete are you? And then we're going to teach you football. But in this transfer portal in this year, they've brought in more non-Power 5 production than ever, right? I mean, they got Watson Trent, Jameer Khan, and Jalen George. Like they brought in dudes who haven't been playing Power 5 football, who don't necessarily have all those measurables, and they bring them into the program. My question to you is, Evan, do you think is it fair to say that Indiana's success and Kurt Cignetti's philosophy of I just want to see what you did in the past and I want to see your production, do you think that might have worn off on Matt Rule, that Matt Rule might have looked at that and said, hey, that might not be a bad idea. That might not be a bad thing to do, to go in and get more guys with production in the non-Power 5 in the transfer portal?
I think it could factor in, but I also think back to what Matt Rule has said a number of times since he's been here, which is Nebraska needs to be the place where these guys go, where they used to go to North Dakota State or somewhere else, and those guys get drafted. He often talks about like, hey, why are there these high-end NFL draft picks that went the FCS route? Mm-hmm. Nebraska needs to find a way to get those guys. And so I think there's a lot of that with what's going on. You know, Andrew Marshall would be another example of that, as a guy from Idaho who they identified as, hey, come in and be in our secondary and fill a need as a return man as well. So like, you know, it certainly Rule's approach with the measurables and the physical tests that you can put guys through to sort of verify what's going on. That's certainly part of it. But like, if you can combine that with proven production at the college football level, like I think that's the sweet spot that Nebraska's trying to find. And so like some of these FCS guys that you're mentioning, I think that's where they are with that. Like, you bring them in and they say, okay, you check the boxes of somebody that we would be interested in out of high school, but now you also have those statistics to mix into that. So again, they've been more in the mix for guys like that this year. It's more competitive than it's ever been. I think maybe the difference this year is other schools are sort of jumping into that Indiana sort of way of thinking, whereas maybe 2 or 3 years ago there would have been a more popular sort of way of thinking where you say, hey, I want the former 4-star, the former 5-star who's from a big time program. I think now there's it's more of a mainstream thought now that, hey, a lot of times these guys at lower levels, maybe they developed later, maybe they showed something, and now those guys are just as sought after as some of these former top recruits as well.
You've covered football for a long time, and we'll cover football that will include a new special teams coordinator. Is special teams predicated on the coach or the players that are available to snap, hold, kick, punt, return, block, cover?
I mean, it's both, right? Like they had trouble with long snapping last year. And so like that, at some point, like if whoever the coach is, like you're putting a guy out there, and at some point you have to say, your long snapper does need to do his job, right? Your kicker needs to hit the ball square. Your place kicker needs to put the ball between the uprights. So like you can coach technique and philosophy and mentality, but on game days, like you're kind of at the mercy of whatever your player does at that point. So, it's such a hand in hand or hand in glove sort of deal where you do need players who can come in and execute, and they've got that now, it seems, with a new long snapper, a new punter. We'll see if John Holt continues to ascend and develop the way that he did. But I just think, the best special teams, it's a culture, right? Like you think about Frank Beamer at Virginia Tech back in the day, Beamer ball, like that was a culture. Iowa, it's a culture. Like you have a good special teams coach there, but like that's an emphasis on what they do. And so I think it comes down to Matt Rule setting that standard and whatever that looks like. And so it'll be interesting to see what direction he goes with that next coordinator. But I do think it starts at the top, and the head coach defines what special teams is going to be. I mean, there are schools that aren't very good at it, that it's sort of an afterthought, and players go and they want to play offense or defense, and if you have to play special teams, okay. But then there are a lot of other places, and I think the best places, where there is an acknowledgement that those units, even though they don't have a ton of snaps, have a disproportionate effect on the outcome of a game. And so, we'll see how that turns for Matt Rule in Nebraska. It wasn't nearly good enough for these 2 years. I think the one thing you can say about Matt Rule is that he, as much as any coach that I can think of, he is very self-aware. And I think his ability to kind of look big picture and to sort of zoom out on things and acknowledge what needs to be changed is one of his strengths. And so to go and make that change now isn't surprising, given some of the other moves that he's made. And so what he does will be fascinating, but I do think whoever it is, it still is going to come down to the head coach setting that tone at the top, and we'll see if he's able to do that. He had strong special teams at Temple and Baylor in the past. It just hasn't worked out at Nebraska to this point. But I do think his track record would say he has an ability to get that thing right here probably sooner than later.
I know it's not over yet, but is there anything new that you've learned or anything that surprised you so far about this just current transfer portal cycle, whether it be a Nebraska thing or just a national takeaway?
I thought maybe there would have been more departures for Nebraska at this point, if I'm being honest. I think what we're seeing instead is a lot of guys that want to see this thing through. Maybe a lot of guys that don't necessarily want to leave as they're trying to get down to the 105 by August. Like, I think there was an assumption that when the portal opened last month, you were going to see like 30 Huskers enter it right away. And you saw whatever the number is up to now. I think there's been 30 guys to this point, but there's still, 25 or so over, somewhere in that range. And so I think that was sort of an expectation, was you'd see more departures early. We'll see how that shakes out in the spring window. And you're probably going to see some more guys depart quietly, or maybe just leave the sport or whatever it might be. But beyond that, I think the other notable thing, just as compared even to last year, has been the how quickly the stakes have risen financially. I mean, a year or two ago, the numbers that guys were commanding are so much different than they are now, and rev share plays into that, and scarcity of roster positions and numbers play into that. But it's really surprising to see how quickly those numbers have risen. I'll be fascinated to see where the market sets. Like, I still don't feel like we have a sense on what the market's going to be long term for this. I don't know how sustainable some of the NIL contributions or NIL fundraising efforts are going to be. A lot of that's going to shift over to revenue sharing. You would think, sort of like the NFL, there's going to be a sort of a general model that a lot of teams use to value positions and things like that. But I think it's just a reminder, man, that this is such a fluid time in college athletics, college football right now, where there is really no such thing as normal. Everyone's trying to kind of figure it out on the fly, trying to find an edge, trying to find an inefficiency. And, until there's some sort of collective bargaining agreement and more uniform set of rules, I think this is just kind of where we are, where, you're every day is different. You're trying to survive in this world of perpetual free agency. And I think the teams that are most well-resourced and that are the most willing to think outside the box and think creatively are probably the ones that are going to have the most success.
Hey, years from now, somebody will be going through the media guide and they'll ask their father or their grandfather, hey, this guy on this receptions by Nebraska tight ends and career yards, this Thomas Fidone guy, it said he had 61 catches in the last 2 years, which are the most among pass catchers for Nebraska. Tell me about Thomas Fidone's career. It's an interesting one, Evan. Now that it's over, how would you describe Thomas Fidone's career at Nebraska, from committing, which was a pretty big deal over in Council Bluffs, to quietly leaving Nebraska and moving forward in his football career?
You know who he reminds me of, Gary, in that sense? He kind of reminds me of Marlon Lucky. And the reason I say that is because he came in as a really highly touted recruit too, and he didn't live up to whatever those expectations were for a guy like that. But like, when you look back on the numbers and the production, you're like, you know what? He actually did pretty well at Nebraska. So like, I kind of think of Fidone in that light, where, it's right. Like you mentioned, he's top 10 in receiving yards and receptions by a tight end in Nebraska history. But I think he's going to fall victim, at least in the short term, to memories of, he was the number one recruit and he didn't live up to that. And he had those 2 ACLs. And so, man, what could that have been like if he was healthy and if they had a different coordinator and if they didn't have the coaching changes. But he still, I think, had a pretty darn good career there. I mean, his ability to go up and high point of football and make a catch with a guy hanging on him, I think is as good as anyone Nebraska's had in recent years. His attitude is just infectious. Like, he's a dude, man. Anyone who's been to Lewis Central or Missouri Valley, Iowa, where he's from, man, like he's a guy who he's real and goes out and works. And he was a Husker fan growing up, had the motivation. He's a guy who could have quit multiple times and said, forget it. I don't want to go through another rehab session, but he's one of those guys who loved the game. Ultimately wasn't part of a lot of winning at Nebraska, but I don't think that was for lack of effort, for lack of ability. And so we'll see kind of where his career goes from here. You know, you wish him the best of luck in the NFL, and if that's the route he chooses to go. But I think when you talk about just guys who embody what Nebraska is all about and wants its players to be all about, man, I'd put Thomas Fidone pretty high on that list.
Evan, as always, we appreciate it. Thank you. I'm sure it will not lack for news again this week. Great job. Welcome back, and we'll talk to you next Monday.